Good afternoon and welcome to Praxis Peace Institute's Friday Zoom series. I'm Georgia Kelly, the Director of Praxis, and today we are very fortunate to welcome back Peter Goodman, who was with us earlier when he wrote Davos Man, How the Billionaires Devoured the World. And today we're going to talk about his new book, How the World Ran Out of Everything. This book is our choice for the Praxis Book Club meeting in August. Peter Goodman is an economics journalist and the global economics correspondent for the New York Times. He played a lead role in the paper's award-winning coverage of the Great Recession, including a series that was a Pulitzer Prize finalist. He was previously based in London as the New York Times European economics correspondent and spent a decade in Shanghai as the bureau chief for the Washington Post. So welcome, Peter. It's great to have you back.
Thank you so much. It's great to be back, Georgia.
Yes, you feel like an old friend now.
Oh, I feel that way too. Well, anytime I'm talking to a group in Sonoma County, I definitely feel that way. I've spent a lot of good times there.
Great, and you will spend more. So before we get into the weeds on this book, I'd like maybe for you to give us an overview of the shipping industry and some of the, we'll get the details next, but I think very few people realize how much international shipping is going on, from the huge cargo ships that dock in ports all over the world to the trucking companies that deliver goods to their final destinations. This is a massive industry. So maybe if you could just touch a little bit on the overview of what we're looking at with shipping worldwide, and then we'll get into
Sure. For lack of a better term, the global supply chain, which implies a more carefully designed system that exists, like a bunch of wizards went up to the top of a mountain and contemplated how to make stuff and efficiently get it to our doors, when it's really this sort of ad hoc jury rig system. It's a lot of deregulation goes into explaining how it's worked. But, the transportation components, railroads, trucking, international shipping. These are things that we're really invited to never think about. We go on Amazon or wherever, and we click the buy button, and we just take for granted that within a couple of days, sometimes even just a few hours, somebody shows up at our door. We don't even have to interact with that person, and we get our goods. Well, it's a little like flipping the light switch. You're not thinking about the electrical grid and the physics of all that, to say nothing of the structure of those industries. But when the lights go out, and especially if it happens when you really need them. I mean, our supply chain failed in the middle of the worst public health catastrophe in a century. It's hard not to wonder what's going on, what has happened. And what I argue in the book is, I mean, you have to look at every component of the transportation industry globally differently. But, shipping itself is this largely unregulated international cartel where you have three alliances of carriers. I mean, sort of like airline alliances, like your Star Alliance or One World or what have you, that dominate the most lucrative routes. And those are the routes from Asia to the West Coast of the US, especially the twin ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach, which are the gateway for, something like 40% of all imported goods that come into the United States by container ship, and then Asia to Europe. And we're talking like 80, 90, 95% market share, depending upon which route. And so that puts these companies, and not by accident, in a position where anytime there's a shock, anytime there's anxiety in the marketplace over the ability to get your goods where they need to go, the prices skyrocket. And the story that I tell, where I'm, tracing the passage of this one shipping container from Ningbo, China, a factory in Ningbo, China, to Long Beach, and then onto a warehouse in Mississippi, involves, a journey that had once cost $2,500 right before the pandemic. And the guy whose container I follow, he ends up paying more than 28,000 for the same journey. And by the way, this is happening again because as the Houthis in Yemen are firing on vessels headed into the Red Sea on the way to the Suez Canal as an expression of solidarity with Palestinians in Gaza. The result of this is that ships are they're not going through the Suez Canal, which is this incredibly important way to go pass between Europe and Asia, and also Asia and the east coast of the U.S. They're instead going the long way around Africa. And I've had analysts tell me that the extra costs of going that longer route, maybe 25, 30% increase. Well, we've seen a 400% increase in container shipping just in the last few months on all routes, because in order to maintain weekly schedules on those Asia to Europe routes back and forth, they have to pull ships from other places. So capacity is cut everywhere. Anyway, the not unfunny punchline of my book is that after every chapter where I look at some industry and I look at the disruption and real people affected, whether we're talking about important things like medicines not being available in a pandemic, or, personal protective gear, or more frivolous things like the contents of the container I follow, these light up, Elmo themed bath toys. We ran out of a lot of stuff, and for our distress, we get rising prices and record profits for the industries that are behind a lot of this stuff, because there's a lot of engineered scarcity in the supply chain.
Yeah, that actually was one of my questions about engineered scarcity. But before we get to that, I want to go to a real human story here, which I found fascinating. When you rode with the truck driver for 3 days and stayed in his bunk bed or whatever,
Yeah,
I mean, that whole situation that you describe, and the man, what he has to go through, the hours he might spend waiting to be able to load his truck, he's not paid for. I mean, that
right,
just blew my mind, that he's paid by the mile, not by the
right.
hour. I mean, these things are horrendous. So tell us about that trip with the truck driver.
Yeah, well, I'm glad that you framed it the way you did, because I use this story and others in the book to note that in this just-in-time world where this supply chain is supposed to be engineered to get us our stuff exactly when we need it, time is of the essence. E-commerce companies are fighting it out to see who can get us our stuff more quickly. We treat the people who are actually doing the work, like this truck driver, Stephen Graves, with whom I rode from Kansas City to Dallas and back in the middle of the winter in early 2022. We treat them as if their own time is basically unlimited and really unimportant. So we've got lots of people who are on flexible schedules. That's the term that the consultants like to use for you're not in control of your time. You have no idea, even if you have parents to look after, older people to care for, or you just would like to know when you're going to be working and when you're not. You're just effectively on call all the time, but only paid for the hours when you're actually at your job. So I got in the cab in Kansas City with Stephen Graves. I wanted to understand why it was that so many of the supply chain disruptions and the shortages of things were being blamed on a supposed shortage of truck drivers, as if these people had just kind of lost their appetite to work. And, we heard all the stories about, supposedly emergency unemployment benefits, as if uh, people would rather just sit around cashing checks that are slightly more than the tiny checks they got before and now are still basically poverty wages. That's not a satisfying explanation at all. And what I learned is that we've got basically 10 million people in the United States with commercial driver's licenses. That's the thing you need to get behind the wheel of a tractor trailer. And we really only need a third that many, but we've so downgraded the job that huge numbers of people have just quit. And the trucking industry's response to this is to try to put as many people into the pipeline to be trained, often by these predatory training mills where, the trucking company will pay for the cost of getting your certification, but then you're bound to that company for a certain number of months or years. Then they try to get you to sign off on buying a truck at a wildly inflated price, through a leasing arrangement where you're then required to get your truck serviced at the place that, it's often a subsidiary of the trucking company, again, inflated prices. So I wanted to see this for myself. And I found an outfit in Kansas City that said, sure, we'll hook you up with this guy, Stephen Graves, who's been driving for 20 years, liked his job. I mean, I saw the best that trucking gets. It's a guy who doesn't have kids, isn't doesn't have a partner waiting for him, unhappy that he's on the road all the time, and actually likes the whole, I could be anywhere all the time. But that myth, and it is a myth, quickly died for both of us when you can see that really these guys just ride around the seamy service corridor of every city in America, and it all looks largely the same. Applebee's, liquor stores, superstores, service stations, truck stops. They don't actually get to see much of anything, and they're in a constant state of agitation. They want to caffeinate enough that they don't fall asleep at the wheel. I mean, the way Graves put it to me, if you're not scared out here, you're a fool, because you got a 53-foot trailer loaded up with, we were hauling parts for farm machinery. And then at one point he picked up a load for Walmart. It was, dog food and salsa and contact lenses. All this stuff weighs a lot. It takes a mile. I'm sorry, it takes the length of a football field to stop one of these trailers. So you're trying to caffeinate so you don't fall asleep, but you don't want to have to constantly pull over to use the restroom because you're worried about where you're going to park the truck. You're worried about delays, your slot at the warehouse. Once you get to the warehouse, you don't know if you'll be waiting for hours because the warehouse doesn't have enough people. Now, let me just note that this has always been a really tough job. But before Carter deregulated, and we tend to like to start the deregulation story with Reagan, who certainly is monumentally important in the story of American deregulation, but a lot of this stuff started with Carter. The Teamsters were in charge, and the Teamsters are, of course, a very controversial union, but they demonstrate the benefit of having a union behind you. And it was a tough job where people got paid a lot. And so there were always enough people willing to do it. And now people get paid, depending upon how you measure it, 40% of what they used to make. We're talking about these are working poor people who are chasing the dream of becoming homeowners, sending kids to college, but they're usually stuck in some kind of predatory leasing arrangement with the trucking companies, and that's why we got the shortage.
Yeah, this is very interesting. Another thing that I didn't know about at all is that the tariffs that Trump had placed on China, and then it been continued under Biden, that we are actually importing less from China and starting to import more from Vietnam and Mexico. I don't really know about that. I mean, I knew about Vietnam, but not Mexico. And how is this changing? Two things. One is, how is this changing our relationship with China? Because it looks like we're really setting up a Cold War with China that's
Yeah,
dangerous. And
right.
I wanted to get your perception on this changing. I mean, on one level, it seems good because we're polluting less if we get our goods from a closer place. But on the other hand, it's coupled with this tariff on China that seems to be punitive.
Yeah, I mean the tariffs on China, first introduced by Trump, extended by Biden, and then Biden's added some new ones, and now of course we've got the possibility of Trump coming back and threatening to put 60% tariffs across the board on Chinese goods. This is kind of a meat cleaver applied to a problem that requires surgery. There are issues in our relationship with China, no question, but uh, I find it more than concerning that both parties seem to agree that we ought to be on a Cold War footing with China. And the part of this, by the way, that never gets discussed is the reality that Americans have benefited dramatically from trade with China. It's just that the Americans who benefited the most are the investor class. And we've basically abandoned the roughly 2 million people who lost their jobs to a surge of imports after China entered the World Trade Organization in 2001. We've abandoned them with virtually no help. I mean, we have trade adjustment assistance that's always underfunded. We, of course, I'm not breaking any news here, don't have national health care in the United States. We have very minimal housing support for anybody, and especially people in a town where a factory goes out of business and everybody's house is underwater at the same time. We just haven't dealt with that at all. And so it makes for, a pleasing story from populists who, are always looking for some outsider to demonize, whether it's, Central American gangs or Mexican migrants or Muslims, or in this case, China. And it's worth remembering that the story of how so much production went to China is a continuation of how we built the railroads in the United States. I mean, we literally recruited Chinese laborers to come and undercut largely Irish laborers who didn't like unsafe conditions, poor wages, working for monopolists. So we imported Chinese labor. Then, of course, we passed the Chinese Exclusion Act. And all these years later, you can draw a straight line from that to Walmart going over to China and forging what I argue is the most important joint venture in the history of global capitalism, that between the People's Republic of China. I mean, it's full of irony, this institution that, starts with this peasant-led rebellion in the name of Marxist ideology, with Walmart, America's largest retailer. But that's basically what it was. I mean, Walmart goes over there along with every other multinational because unions are banned. You can get your hand on huge pieces of land as long as you cut in some local Communist Party official. You don't have to worry about environmental regulations. Container shipping is basically free because most of the foreign companies that are running it view it as a way to boost their own exports. So it's very cheap. It's generally very reliable. And we build a system where if you're Walmart or any other large retailer, it doesn't matter whether the factory's in Ohio or in southern China, as long as it's connected to a port and trucking and rail, we're good. So the fact that that's now breaking down is in some ways healthy, though the demonization of China as this, job stealing, livelihood stealing juggernaut is full of all sorts of racist tropes and is I think quite dangerous. But the idea that place is back, that we are back to realizing that a factory in Ohio is not the same as a factory in China, and it would be a good thing to take note of that and have rules that certainly address the emissions issues in terms of climate change. That's to the good, but this could go a lot of different ways.
Yeah, I realize it could. And the way I asked the question, it could go a lot of different ways. Maybe quickly, you can tell us how massive is international shipping? Like how many big cargo ships might be in the sea at one time?
Boy, you're catching me unawares. I don't know how many ships are in the sea. I know that there are, at any given time, something like, boy, I'd have to look up my own book. There are tens of millions of shipping containers moving around at any given time, and they're carrying trillions of dollars worth of cargo. And I'll give you one fun fact that's right in my mind because I just came back from Panama doing a story on the future of the Panama Canal. It takes 50 million gallons of water, fresh water, from an artificial lake to move a single container vessel through the Panama Canal. And in normal times, something between 38 and 40 container vessels move through, or vessels, period. They're not all container ships, move through the Panama Canal every day. So we're talking about an industry that's just cosmically huge. I mean, when you're alongside one of these giant container ships, it's like nothing else that I've ever experienced. I mean, if you've been through next to a massive cruise ship, it's like that times four. The container ship that carried the container that I follow in my book, something like four times the size of Grand Central Station in Manhattan. The scale's enormous, and as a result, there are huge barriers to entry. If you're running a port that's big enough to deal with these giant vessels, you don't have much competition, and that's increasingly so the bigger the vessels get. There's been a lot of work showing that the economies of scale that one would think would flow from putting so many of these boxes, some of these ships can carry 20,000 containers in one go. The economies of scale that you get start to break down once you throw in the lack of barriers to entry because we're building monopolies.
You're right. And that seemed like they control who gets the empty containers and who gets to park where. at the docks. So,
I mean, the whole thing's optimized for big box retailers. I mean, I
right.
had a really eye-opening experience when I was with a so-called dray operator. These are the truck drivers who move containers between ports and warehouses. So in this case, I was going from LA and Long Beach to the Inland Empire, Riverside County, Southern California. And we were at the port of Long Beach, and the driver said, "Oh man, I just got pulled over for an inspection. It looks like the chassis, that's the big piece of equipment behind the front, the cab that actually holds the container. It looks like there's a problem there. This is going to cost me my whole day. It's going to take hours to get inspected. If I need another chassis, who knows how long that will take." I said, "But there's a parking lot right there. It looks like there's hundreds of chassis." He said, "Oh, that's the Amazon pool. That's dedicated for Amazon." And Amazon, of course, could afford to charter its own container ships in the worst of the crisis. So in the worst of the crisis, you've got 70 plus ships just floating off of LA Long Beach, waiting sometimes weeks at a time for their chance to pull up to the dock and load and unload, because the whole system is so swamped by this surge of orders for factory goods in the middle of the pandemic. Well, not Amazon. Amazon managed to pull up to the docks much more quickly. And I remember reading an interview with a shipping analyst in Copenhagen who said, "Yeah, my advice to Amazon would be just pay the additional cost because your competitor is drowning. So you will emerge from this with greater market share, less competition." I mean, it's the old monopoly playbook.
Yeah, that's what's kind of shocking. There were two, before we go into audience questions, there were kind of two things I was interested in you commenting on. One is kind of the question is sort of posed in your book: is globalization dead because of actually getting supplies from a nearer source than China, like from Mexico, or so that we don't have to have as many miles between the product and getting it here. There's also the
Right.
problem of the tchotchkes that don't need to be made and don't need to be sold and don't need to be shipped. But I guess we don't need to get into that. But so I do want your thoughts on the whole globalization, how this might be changing. You mentioned something that I just wanted to pass by with when you mentioned the Panama Canal, because it looked like you said it was getting so shallow that that wasn't clear that the ships could always get through because of climate change.
Right.
Uh, yeah,
Like you're asking what's going on there?
yeah.
Well, so El Nino, which is this phenomenon where you get higher water temperatures and less wind and more evaporation and less rainfall, has essentially produced drought, severe drought in Panama over the last year or so. And I didn't know this actually since I started doing this story. I guess from looking at children's books and illustrations of canals, I just assumed the Panama Canal was this cutout of land where the two oceans merge. No, I mean this is a freshwater drainage system where there's a lake in the center and then locks on both sides. There are no pumps involved. It's all gravity. But if you don't have enough rainwater landing in the lake, you got a problem. And so, for the first time in the 110-year history of the Canal Authority actually lowered the allowable draft of the vessels, the depth of the vessels, which forced vessels to unload some of their cargo. And then they severely restricted the number of vessels that could go through because, again, it takes 50 million gallons of water to get one ship through. So, at the worst of it in December, I think they were letting 22 ships a day pass down from the usual, 36 to 38. And there are ripple effects from that. And that's, unlike the Houthi situation, which is presumably going to last as long as there's no ceasefire. And unlike, some of the issues we've been discussing, which are geopolitical in nature in terms of U.S. China, I mean, we're dealing with the climate. The climate is going to do what the climate's going to do. And so the Panama Canal authorities are now actively looking to expand storage, which means building a new dam and flooding a couple thousand people out of their homes. who I recently visited with. They're not real happy about having to give up their farmland so that, people in the suburbs of New York can get stuff from Walmart quicker and, more efficiently.
Yeah, the whole system has to change. I want to finish my part with a quote that you gave in the book from the late Barbara Ehrenreich, where she said, quote, "The working poor are the major philanthropists today." And I'd
Right.
just like you to comment on that, and then I'll open up to questions because I think this.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's a really important point. We have built this supply chain that depends upon large numbers of people being desperate enough for jobs that they're willing to work in dangerous conditions at very little pay with no way to spend regular time with their families. And that's our normal. So
Mhm.
when we talk about, when is the supply chain going to get back to normal? When will I be able to get the cabinets that I want at IKEA instead of whatever's on offer? When can I know that my doctor will be able to get all the medicines that I need, or the medical device companies will be able to make their stuff? Normal is built on an awful lot of labor exploitation. And one of the stories I tell in the book is I excavate the history of Henry Ford, who, of course, is a very problematic character, not someone we should lionize. He was a racist and anti-Semite. He crushed organized labor, but he knew a thing or two about making products and shipping them. And one of the things that he said, back in 1914, he famously doubled factory wages to $5 an hour. Some people call him a communist. And he said, "No, I'm a capitalist. I just want to make my stuff reliably. And I've come to understand that any business that's dependent upon low wage labor is inherently unstable. I want people showing up, giving me their best. I don't want them worried about paying their bills." And that's something that, I mean, there's a lot to think about in my book, some of which we've talked about, these long supply chains in a sense of place. But boy, if you had to distill it all down, we ought to be thinking a lot harder about the people who we're depending on to make and deliver our stuff. And if my book achieves nothing else, I hope that, no one will ever look at a package landing at their door the same way again.
No, you've changed our perception on that completely. I just want to show the book again because this is really worth reading, How the World Ran Out of Everything. So that's Peter's new book, and that's what we've been talking about. There's so much I couldn't cover in the book because there's so much in the book. But Jerry, I see you've got your hand up.
Yeah, thanks for a really interesting presentation.
Thank you.
Um, it sounds like the Teamsters are no longer representing the truckers. So I was just curious as to, what's the history of that?
Yeah, good question. So there was a significant deregulation that went down the tail end of the Carter administration that lifted limits on the numbers of trucking companies that could operate. So there was basically an agreement prior to deregulation that the Teamsters would make sure that every route was served, that there were enough drivers, and they were militant in demanding a piece of the action. So they got really good wages. And the end of that produced this free for all, where perversely, I mean, especially given what else I write about in this book, there was kind of too much competition. Suddenly, anybody could enter the fray with no regulation on the pricing or the conditions for drivers. And so we got this situation where nobody could be profitable without squeezing their drivers. And that's the situation that we're in today.
Okay, Matt, you're next.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. Excellent book. I really enjoyed it. I
Oh,
had a question about something you wrote on page 299 under rules imposed by the International Maritime Organization, the United States Arms that regulates shipping. The industry was required to upgrade its fleet to limit emissions. I read this book, and now I just looked up, and it was written almost 20 years ago. The Outlaw Sea by William Langesweich. I don't know if you're familiar with it.
Oh yeah, yeah, I am familiar. I haven't read that book, but I've
Yeah,
heard.
but I mean, basically, the premise, the point of this book was there is no international regulation. it is the Wild West. Once you get international waters, all these shippers are doing things that would be illegal in the waters of any nation in which they trade. But once they get outside of international waters, it's completely unregulated. And so I was surprised that I didn't really think the United Nations had any effective regulation of emissions of international shipping. That's why they use the most polluting and heaviest, cheapest, dirtiest fuel in ships, because they're used in international waters where they're not subject to any local emissions regulations.
Well, there are some changes afoot, though, that are pretty significant, and most of them are coming out of Europe. So, I mean, the European Union has got a bunch of different supply chain regulations coupled with a carbon tax that is forcing companies that do significant amounts of business in the European Union. I think it's if you sell 500 million euros worth of products a year, or services for that matter, in the European Union, you're by law required to disclose a lot of details about your supply chain, including, your forestry practices if you're dealing with wood. And this is not unlike the role that California has played in the United States in terms of emission standards. I mean, California is big enough that if you've got higher emission standards than Detroit, or Detroit's sort of an old term now, but wherever the cars are being built, they're not going to make them to satisfy California standards and Florida standards. They're just going to make them at one standard because California is big enough and Europe's big enough. So that I think is hopeful. But there's no question that it's pretty wild out there on the ocean. And certainly if you're talking about, wages for crew, treatment of workers, I mean, there's an awful lot to be very concerned about.
Yeah. Ben, you have your hand up.
Yes, I'm glad to talk with someone who formerly worked with the Washington Post, because I am, after a lifetime of being sold on the neoliberal globalization is the future of the world and this vast interconnected network of commerce, why the line seems to be changing. And there's the support for a new Cold War with China, which is completely antithetical to this neoliberal globalist mercantilist plan. And now tariffs are part of the discussion. Where do you think this push for the new Cold War is coming from? Who is motivating that?
I think it's coming from a lot of different quarters, but I think at the center of it is the realization that our deal with China has been a bad one for some very discreet people in the United States. I mean, it's hard to answer this in a simple way, but my overall take, as I was getting into earlier, is that I think we are excessively prone to blaming China for home cooked problems. I mean, trade with China has actually been a consumer bonanza, and a lot of the literature shows that spending power has increased because of trade with China. But we also know that there are a lot of factors that aren't captured by that sort of analysis. Some of that's environmental, as we've discussed. I mean, emissions associated with moving ships across oceans. Some of that is about resilience. To end up in a situation where you're in a pandemic and you discover that the vast majority of your PPE is coming from a country across the Pacific that, not incidentally, we're having a trade war with. That's a real problem. And then the growing inequality that has created opportunities for those inclined to demonize, immigrants, the Chinese job stealing juggernaut, globalists, like whatever. That has gotten so traumatic for the people who are not on the winning side of the equation that it's changed the politics. So you now have people like, JD Vance running around
Yeah.
blaming China for everything. Never mind that JD Vance is part of a party that wants to, deregulate crypto and advance the old Trump tax cuts, which are not going to do anything for ordinary working people and are going to be wonderful for plutocrats. But in terms of the rhetoric, it's very appealing to politicians who don't want to have to explain how they've allowed the winners in American-style globalization, and again, that's mostly the investor class, to end up with most of the bounty while they've allowed, deindustrialized communities to just kind of fester in joblessness and now the opioid crisis. It's a hell of a lot easier to go blame a country on the other side of the ocean.
Mhm. Okay, Mike, it looks like you're next.
Peter, thanks a lot. It's a really great topic, which
Thank
I
you.
haven't heard. It's really amazing amount of interesting facts. If you wouldn't mind, what you said about Panama,
Yeah.
and the water, and incredible numbers you gave, and I just don't really understand what you were saying there. And would you mind just briefly sort of explaining that again and what you said about the fresh water and everything?
I mean, basically, the Panama Canal is a freshwater drainage system. There's a freshwater lake at the center, what used to be mountains. And then the freshwater spills out in both directions toward the Atlantic coast and toward the Pacific coast. And there are a bunch of locks that are used to, lift up ships on the way in and lower them down gradually on the way out. And if you don't have enough water in that lake to send the water that you need to lift up a container ship or lower it down gracefully, then you can't operate the canal. So they've had to conserve the water.
I see.
But I'll tell you, the fact that stayed with me from writing the book that is closer to where you guys are, that really blew my mind, is I wrote about the plight of the almond farmers in the Central Valley. You probably know this. I didn't know this. California is the source of 80% of the almonds in the world. Even in a state that's famous for Hollywood and the tech industry, obviously ag is still the giant business. And I was writing about the almond farmers in a somewhat sympathetic way because they are in this situation where at the time I'm writing about them, they can't get the shipping industry to stop in Oakland to pick up almonds. So I'm visiting with farmers who've already sold their crop from the year before to Dubai, to Japan, but they can't get the crop there. And until the crop is delivered, they don't get paid. And their warehouses are full of last year's almonds while they're about to harvest this year's almonds. So they're in an incredible panic. And it turns out that the shipping industry is making so much money moving factory goods from China to the West Coast to, LA Long Beach, that the carriers don't want to do what they usually do, which is unload those goods and then take some empty containers and send them up to places like, Fresno by rail or by truck and pick up almonds. They're like, no, we don't have time for that. We got to get the empty ones back to China as quickly as possible to cash in while this gold rush is happening. So you think about that, they're burning diesel fuel to move air across the Pacific. But as I'm telling this story in the book, I realized that the almond industry itself is its own crazy globalization story because the almond industry requires twice as much water as the entire LA metro area in the course of a year. So in the middle of drought, I don't have to tell you guys this, California is essentially taking its water via the almond and burning diesel fuel to ship water to Dubai. That is bananas.
Yeah.
But that's the global supply chain that our perverse incentives have created.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned about the water that the almond industry uses. And agricultural generally in California uses 80% of the water. So when people, are careful about their faucet dripping, I mean, that is really a drop in the water, so to speak, because the major portion of water being used, and a lot of it is wasted. A
Yeah.
lot of the agricultural water is wasted. You can see the sprinkling system going when it's raining. So it's not controlled well or regulated well. I see that Matt has another question.
I as an environmentalist, and I've been, my whole life, I've read all the environmental literature, and Georgia made a comment, and I agree. Common sense would say that, the container shipping, is very polluting. However, I thought I've read, and maybe you can clarify this, that because of the economies of scale, those things are so big that the carbon footprint per ton is much less on a shipping container from China than it is, on a diesel truck going from one place in the U.S. to someplace else in the U.S. Just because the amount, even though they're very polluting, the amount of fuel burned per ton is much lower because they're just so massive.
That can be true. I mean, what I found, and you probably know more about this than I do. I've only dug into some examples, but it depends. Basically, it depends what product you're talking about, how that product is produced, and the means of conveyance. But the point is, we haven't built our supply chain with these sorts of considerations in mind. So, rail ought to be a much bigger part of the transportation puzzle in the U.S. Than it is. And it's not basically because we've allowed investor interest to dictate how it works to a really perverse degree. And this is a story that goes all the way back to the robber barons. I mean, I was really interested in reading some of the history of, the building of the transcontinental, that you go back to the 19th century where the federal government gives land grants to the railroad systems that are under construction. And so Union Pacific, guess what? They don't route their system to go efficiently from point A to point B. They build these kind of meandering loops so they can maximize how much free land they get from the federal government. And today we have something called precision scheduled railroading, which is like just in time on the rails. And what it really means is like fire a lot of people who used to take care of railroads, push the engineers who are still around, harder than ever, diminish the number of trains that are on routes, but make those trains longer than ever. So if there's a safety problem, it's now much more likely to be deadly, like the thing we saw in East Palestine. And in the middle of reporting the book, I stumbled on this engineer in Idaho who told me that he was appalled to discover that he was pulling his cargo to the wrong destinations. He was doing these runs from Nebraska to Oregon, and frequently he discovered, oh no, this stuff was supposed to be going south to California, but it's going to Oregon because Wall Street wants lower dwell time. That's the metric as part of precision scheduled railroading that the investors are enthralled by, and your share price will go up if you deliver on lowered dwell time. That's the amount of time that cargo sits at any given place. So this translates into an imperative for the guy running the Union Pacific rail yard in Nebraska. Wherever the next train's going, I'm attaching as many cars to it as possible because I'm doing my job. I'm lowering dwell time. Never mind that there's somebody in California is waiting for auto parts. Well, now they're in Oregon. They're going to have to go back through Idaho to get there. Never mind that, somebody wants to make paint and this guy's carrying their chemicals, and now somebody can't get the paint they want, all because we've lowered, dwell time. So I'm sorry, that's a long-winded way of saying that the question of emissions around scale is complex, but we should be very suspicious about whether we got systems that are remotely rationally looking at what ought to be happening. What we've got is a perverse catering of very narrow shareholder interests.
And one of the best examples of that is getting fresh produce that has a very short shelf life from Chile. So shipping grapes or blueberries from Chile by air freight is just incredibly has a huge carbon footprint. Whereas things that are not perishable that can come on a slow boat from China has a much smaller footprint.
No, that's a good point. Yeah.
I like grapes from Chile in the winter.
Hey, we all do, but we
Not
also like
proper.
to survive.
I know it's not really proper. I'm going to let Ben do a last question because we're getting to the end here.
Well, I was interested. You were talking earlier about the reduction in the amount of fuel used and the pollution that it generates. Is there any way through our existing national regulatory systems that at the very least the next step, it would seem to be, is to start moving these container ships to burning something other than this bunker oil fuel, which is actually just literally the bottom of the barrel petrol source? Is that something that is that been discussed in those circles? Because that seemed like that would go a long ways toward reducing the emissions of that.
Yeah, I'm more familiar with what's happening in trucking than in shipping on that front. But yeah, there are so-called alternative fuels that are under discussion. But I think the thing that's happening more immediately is so-called nearshoring, where the retailers are looking to manufacture closer to their customers. And some of that's because of geopolitics. I mean, some of that's because of the Trump trade war, now Biden trade war, and the reality that whatever happens in our delicious pageantry of democracy now underway, whoever emerges victorious, U.S.-China trade animosity seems like something you can count on. And then, part of its pandemic disruption. But, I spent time in the book with Columbia Sportswear going to look at factories in Guatemala. I spent a lot of time in Mexico for the reporting of the book, looking at how, Walmart's looking to shift production from China to Mexico. And some of that's happening, by the way, because the large manufacturers are demanding it. I was really interested when I was down in Monterrey, which is in Nuevo León. It's a border state. I ran into all these Korean companies who were making, parts for the auto industry, and I talked to this one guy, and he said, "Yeah, well, John Deere is a big customer of ours. They have a factory in Victoria, Texas, and they've told us if you don't get yourself within 5 hours of our plant in Victoria, Texas, you're going to lose our business. We're going to go find another supplier because they did not like having to wait for months and months for the replenishment of parts they needed coming over from Asia in the middle of the pandemic, and they're certainly nervous about the U.S.-China trade war. So that's going on as well."
Hmm. Yeah, the China trade war, well, that seems to be something that is looming for, I don't know whether disaster is the right word, but because it's not just economic, it's also political. It seems very dangerous in a way, the
I mean,
political.
the idea that look, I'm not a huge fan of TikTok. I don't want my kids wasting their time on TikTok. But the idea that on the list of all of the things that we should be worrying about as actual threats to national security, it's this dumb app with these stupid little videos. I mean, come on, we're in a moment where we're holding up cranes being deployed at ports in the United States because they're all made by China, and somebody's convinced Congress that there's something magic about these cranes in terms of spying capacity. I mean, are we really doing this? Like those weird weather balloons? We're chasing phantoms here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we are, and that's part of the story that we're told to manipulate our beliefs, I think.
I mean, of course, the Chinese government is spying on us,
And
and
we're
we're spying on the
on
Chinese
them.
government. This is
Right.
how giant states that control huge militaries and have great aspirations operate. But I mean, do we really want to go down this road where like anything that's made in China is going to be deemed a national security threat?
Yeah, this is kind of shocking. I wanted to ask you, Peter, if you have something that you want to leave us with. I had not mentioned Henry Ford because I'd heard some of that before, but I thought it was very interesting that you brought that out. He is a complicated character because of his personal beliefs, but his work ethic was very interesting at that time, and it certainly goes against the work ethic by corporate America today.
Yes. I mean, he was very suspicious of the investor class.
Right.
Some of this was tied up in his anti-Semitism, Jewish banker tropes.
Right.
But some of it was he was interested in building out operations over the long haul. And the Dodge brothers were some of his earliest investors. And as Ford is trying to build this giant plant on the River Rouge outside of Detroit, where he wants to have the capacity to make, I mean, this is the beginning of vertical integration. Like he wants every part of a car to be made right there. And some of this is so fanciful that, he invests in a rubber plant in Brazil that's a disaster. But anyway, the River Rouge becomes quite a success, and it's kind of a monument in the history of mass assembly. And the Dodge brothers notice he's got $50 million in cash on his balance sheet, and they say, we'd really appreciate it if you'd hand over some dividends. And he says, no, I need this to expand. And they sue him, and they win. And it slows the development, though it doesn't stop the development of the River Rouge plant. And I'd argue that there's a straight line from there to the shortages that we experienced during the pandemic disruptions, because forever after, publicly traded companies have got to think about their investors over resilience. And I walked the catwalk at the River Rouge plant. It's 100 years later. It's 2022, and I'm watching the F-150 come off the line. This is their most popular vehicle, their pickup truck. And it's kind of incredible. There's automation and there's these highly skilled workers, and they're all, doing this stuff together, and these gleaming vehicles come off the line. And then they're parking these trucks in the shadow of Ford's corporate headquarters and across the street from Henry Ford Elementary School, because they can't work without the computer chips that are in short supply. Ford, like most auto companies, has decided, because it's cheap, that they're going to depend upon computer chips made on this one island 90 miles off the coast of China to produce. I mean, Henry Ford would have spun in his grave, and therein, is back to the metaphor I made at the beginning about you don't think about the electrical grid until the lights don't go on when you need them. Well, that's the lights not going on when we need them, and we ought to be thinking very seriously about these systems that we're dependent on and how they operate.
Yeah, this is very educational, very useful for all of us to know and to think about and talk about. And I just want to mention the book again, How the World Ran Out of Everything, in this wonderfully whimsical cover that I love.
Thank you.
Yeah, but it's really sobering to read this. And I think we all should understand about transportation, because it's a major part of our world all the time. So I want to thank you, Peter, and I can't wait until you come out here and do a live program.
Oh, I love it. Yeah, I'll give you a heads up. And I appreciate all you guys asking these great questions and your careful reading. It's inspiring to know that something like this exists. Thanks for your attention.
We're reading it in our book club, which will meet on the August 11th. So we will be discussing it in depth in that meeting.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm going to send you something too, Peter, so you'll get it by email.
Oh, you're kind. Okay.
All right. So
All right. Great to talk, guys. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.